Well, welcome. My name is Clay Mathis. I'm director of the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management. And our mission at the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management is sustaining our ranching heritage through education, innovation, and outreach. And today you're on this webinar because of our outreach efforts. We know that this question of should I sell carbon credits has been really a common theme throughout the ranching industry over the last year or years. And back in May of this year, we decided that the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management needed to address the question for this industry that we serve. And so we came together as an institute. We came together as an institute, and we decided that although we didn't have the full expertise to answer this question, to work towards an answer for it alone, we knew that we could put together a team of experts that could do exactly that. And so let me introduce you to the team of experts that we've assembled to try to help guide the producers, particularly in this audience, on this question, because we know it can be a big decision. The lead of our team of experts is Dr. Jason Sawyer. Jason's the Chief Science Officer with the East Foundation, based out of San Antonio, Texas. Also a member of our team, Dave Delaney. Dave is a practitioner in ranch management at the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management. You also probably recognize Dave as a recently retired Vice President and General Manager of Ranching and Wildlife Operations for King Ranch Incorporated. Then also from Texas AgriLife Extension is Tiffany Dow-Lashmet. Tiffany is an attorney, and she's an ag law specialist with Texas AgriLife. As well is Dr. David Anderson. David Anderson is an ag economist with AgriLife Extension. So with that, let me tell you just a couple more things. One is that we also this team created a white paper, and that white paper is going to be distributed to all of you that are on or registered for this event. That'll be distributed at 1 o'clock Central Standard Time. And then we will have a recording of this event that will be available certainly by the middle of next week. We'll try to make it available even sooner because we know that some have not been able to join when they wanted to today. Let me go back one. We've got about an hour's worth of presentation. And with this hour's worth of presentation, we're not going to take questions directly from the speakers then, but we've got an extended Q&A session that we'll have at the end. We've got up to an hour if questions last that long. What you'll need to do is you'll type your question into the question toolbar at the bottom. So you'll type your question in. We also have the opportunity so that we can prioritize these questions when they come in. When you see those questions, you can just click the thumbs up, and the thumbs up if you see a question that you like, will basically vote that question up. So by giving us that signal, we'll know which questions are most important to you. And we can try to ensure that we answer those highest priority questions, those most popular questions first. So that's how we're going to run the webinar. Let me introduce to you Dave Delaney, who I mentioned before. Dave's going to give you really a producer's perspective on this emerging issue. And so Dave, I'll turn it over to you from here.
Thanks, Clay. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on a subject today that I know is at the forefront of many ranchers today, and they want to learn more about what's going on. But I thought I might start by, regardless of what you think about the methodologies we're using or the politics involved, there's little doubt that objective measurement shows that there's been tremendous increase, especially in carbon dioxide as parts per million in our atmosphere. Total greenhouse gases today constitute, according to NOAA, over 500, I think it was 504 parts per million, and we're emitting globally about 52 gigatons or more annually. So, and these increases, about 78% of these carbon dioxide increases are due to anthropogenic or human burning of fossil fuels. So there's an issue right there. And next slide, please. Clay, can you? And while, as I said, I've seen many excellent presentations from developers and verifiers and those parties, this symposium today is being done from the rancher's perspective. So what are the things that you need to consider as you consider whether you should be trading carbon credits? So first off, I thought, well, we could spend days talking about this. There's 3 activities or globally that have led to where we are today. The United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change is a group that has participated in the Kyoto protocols, which the US as of date has not signed on to. However, probably the most important thing coming out of these protocols was for development of the clean development mechanisms of the EU emissions trading system, which allowed exchanges and such to be able to trade these carbon credits in a commercial sense. The Paris Agreement in 2015 was initially not signed on by the US, then retracted, and in January of 2020 we signed on. And probably the most significant part of this is that it defined nationally determined contributions to global warming and the greenhouse gas effect, so that countries could set their own individual priorities and methodologies in addition to carbon trading. US, one interesting fact I think you should know is, I think today forestry and agriculture, between herbaceous mass and soil carbon, actually sequesters about 12% of the total GHG emissions in the United States, and it has the potential to do much more. So while not being the major factor, I think there is a place for agriculture. Internationally, forestry, agriculture, including their fossil fuel use, contribute about 24% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's important, and that we have a role to play in this. Generally, what these various the treaties and protocols have done is the goal is to limit global temperature increase from 1.5 to 2 degrees centigrade from pre-industrial levels, and total greenhouse gas emissions to pre-1990 levels. And I've seen, in order to do this, and the NDCs, they are rolled over every 5 years, and I think now that level is about 18%. And if we reach that level under these protocols, we have about 60% chance of meeting the global greenhouse gas emissions ultimate goal of net zero emissions by 1950. However, not all of this, and Jason will speak more to this, not all of this can be accomplished by changing to from fossil fuel use or by efficiencies. So a market has developed whereby carbon credits can be traded, and some people are predicting that this market could be huge, 230 billion by 2030. So what these treaties and protocols really did was develop a mechanism, even though the US is not participating in the exchanges, a mechanism to promote market trade. One of the key things to understand, and Jason will go over this, is that US currently is a voluntary market versus a mandatory cap and trade type market, as you see in Europe. There is I think the California Air Resource Board under the Western Climate Alliance is actually trading, but the one exchange that existed, the Chicago Climate Exchange, which operated from 2003 to 2010, it might have been a little preliminary, and it's not operating currently. So what we have now, next slide, please, is really a voluntary market whereby interested sellers and buyers participate. Obviously, from a rancher standpoint, they're interested in increasing return to land ownership. They're the only non-margin operator in the beef production chain. In addition, they have the largest investment, that being land, and probably the lowest return on market value of the asset. One side benefit is that by looking at some of these practices that may be required, that they may be able to improve rangeland health and ecological diversity on their property, and thereby providing a socioeconomic benefit, which in my opinion has been too little recognized by the consumer at large. As I said, on the buyer's behalf, they're interested. It is a voluntary market. And one interesting thing is some of the most active players have been oil and gas producers. In 2008, there was legislation passed that required that anyone emitting more than 25,000 tons annually of CO2 equivalent had to report that. So I think they're being proactive, and their consumers are demanding that we take those actions. Two things you may hear about: corporate social responsibility policies and environmental, social, and governance requirements that might be in the bylaws or have been voted in by a corporate board of directors. So even though some of these might not be mandated, so they're trying to be proactive and get ahead of the game. One thing as we go through this, I think that all the players recognize is that the integrity of the system is of the utmost importance. If an industry is purchasing these credits, the last thing they want is the consumer to perceive that it's just that it's really pointless and they're not really doing what they're saying what they're doing. And I also think we have to recognize that on the behalf of that business, as well as the rancher, ultimately it's a business decision by both parties. Is it practical and feasible? Some things to keep in mind as we go through these presentations is, please recognize it's an unregulated market. That does not mean that it's the wild, wild west, but that contract, really in civil court, that's the enforceable aspect of it. And they can be I'm amazed at how standard they are, but they can be highly variable standards. And this is actually a good thing, because the feasibility of instituting carbon trading in the United States under the Kyoto protocols probably is a dead-end street and wouldn't happen. So this gives us an avenue to move forward. I think some ranchers overestimate the potential. I've seen from 0.1 to 0.8 or even a ton per acre annually increases that can be done by implementing several practices annually. And most of these contracts, they're usually 5 years, maybe with a rollover. And the value is currently $18 to $22 a ton. I will say, and I don't want to get into David's presentation, but as we see more mandates take effect as they are in Europe, that price, as it has in California, will probably go up a little. There's a lack of long-term reported results. A lot of these standards, there are ranchers that have shown some excellent results, but there's not a lot of reports of completed contracts and what are the variables. For instance, that can affect your particular operation. For instance, clays can sequester much more carbon than sand, soil depth, the sterile stage at which the initial measurement is done, the baseline, so to speak, that can have a tremendous effect on the delta or change over time. And please remember that these payments are based on soil carbon change, not total soil carbon. That could be several, might be 4,000 or 5,000 pounds in some cases. So it's really based on a delta. So with that in mind, some of the questions we hope to answer for you today include: what is the feasibility, both logistical and economic? And therefore, what is the potential return that I, as a rancher, can expect? What information do I need in order to make a wise decision? And what should I know concerning carbon credits, market transactions, and standard? What is a carbon credit? What are the processes and who are the players, which Jason will explain to you, that will allow me to participate in this market? And also, what are the terms, unit measurements, and standards? Finally, Tiffany will address what are some of the, and David will address, what are some of the production risks? What are the market risks? And because this is an unregulated industry, which doesn't go through an exchange and overseen by the Securities Exchange Commission, it becomes a legal contract. But with any legal contract where we have an obligation to deliver, we have to understand those So hopefully, as I turn this over, Clay, that we will accomplish that and let you make a more informed decision.
Howdy, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. And Dave gave us a great overview of kind of the complexity and questions that we're trying to address. I'm going to take just a few minutes and give you a high-level overview so that at least we're using the same terms to mean the same thing, because often in this space, the terms themselves are confusing. And what exactly is a carbon credit and how did it get that name? I think the best way for us to think about that is as an accounting term. A credit, in this case, is the removal from an account. And so if we think about the greenhouse gases that Dave talked about, and if you look at my overly complicated graphic here, up in the top left corner, you can see that it says the atmosphere and it's got 800 in it. So think of that as the atmospheric account of carbon. And so any emissions that we make to the atmosphere or debits to that atmospheric account, and any removals from the atmosphere are credits. So a carbon credit then is a removal from the atmosphere. When we hear the term carbon neutrality, what that really means is that we're just trying to balance or equalize the debits and credits to the account. So for example, if we had an equal amount of emissions or debits and equal to the credits or withdrawals from that atmospheric account, it would stay the same, right? The account balance itself would stay the same, even though the flows in and out might be rather large. If, however, we increase the emissions, so our debit amount goes up relative to the credit amount, then the size of the atmospheric account grows. And in this case, that's a negative thing. So what we'd like to do is reverse that, where we increase the withdrawals from that atmospheric account to equal to or greater than the amount of emissions. And by doing so, reduce the atmospheric account or burden. So when we think about a carbon credit, that's really what we mean, is a removal from the atmosphere. But just like in any good accounting system, we have to have some sort of units to account for. And so a carbon credit then has been effectively standardized to represent 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalents removed from the atmosphere. Now, a really important feature here for us to all remember is that when we talk about a carbon credit, we really mean a carbon dioxide credit. And when we measure soil carbon, we really mean carbon, and the two are not equivalent. So 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide, a carbon credit, is equivalent to 273 kilograms of actual carbon, because CO2 is made partly of carbon and partly of oxygen. Another way to think of this is that 1 ton of soil carbon, 1 metric ton of soil carbon, is equivalent to 3.67 carbon credits, because that's the carbon dioxide equivalent value. Another way that we often think about a carbon credit is once I have been able to account for it, it could be viewed as an exchangeable permit. And so an emitter, as Dave indicated earlier, they likely can't reduce their emissions to 0. And because they can't reduce their emissions all the way to 0, they have some residual debit to that atmospheric account, and they'd like to be able to find a credit with which to offset it. Thus creates sort of the trading marketplace of carbon debits and credits, if you will. Now, this carbon credit is supposed to represent carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere to reduce that atmospheric burden, and it is supposed to represent permanent removal of that carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If you think back to that complicated carbon cycle graphic on the prior slide, all of that carbon goes up and comes back down. If we could take some of that and set it aside, remove it or sequester it from the carbon cycle, then it would no longer be capable of being a debit to the atmosphere. And so what we really want to think about from the ranching or land management perspective is, how do I actually generate this carbon credit? what is the physical process of generating or producing this product? And really the physical part is photosynthesis. That is the primary mechanism by which atmospheric carbon dioxide can be withdrawn from the atmosphere and converted into some storage depot through the action of a plant. And so the sequestration or accumulation of carbon credits occurs in biomass above ground. And here we typically think about forest accumulation or accumulation in soil. Now, it's important to note that in grasslands or rangelands, the majority of that accumulation does occur below ground rather than in above ground biomass. And so as we think about then that physical process, we need some way to take that and convert it into this sort of accounting process, right? How do we actually account for that withdrawal from the atmospheric account and its sort of storage or accumulation in a way that's verifiable? And because of that, a number of different participants in the process exist. So first we have standards. Standards, think of those as the methods and rules by which we are going to conduct accounting. Importantly, these standards need to define what they mean by additionality and permanence. I'll talk a little bit more about those, but these are important terms and often key distinctions among different sets of standards. A standard setter, it also then serves to review submissions, people who wish to have their carbon credit accumulation certified in accordance with whatever standard has been applied. And then that standard setter will review that and certify and issue then a fungible tradable credit. Now, in order for them to do that, they seek verification from a third-party auditor to certify and ensure that in fact that submission met the standards that were required. The reason that there needs to be a third-party auditor is to remove sort of the incentives, you might say, for a standard setter to accept questionable credits, and obviously for a credit producer, a land manager perhaps, to get as many credits certified as possible. So this third-party audit process is really important with regard to Dave's comment that the marketplace needs to be robust and have objective integrity. Other participants in this process are developers. Developers are developers, right? So developers seek to find and identify opportunities for credit generation. Typically, they might wish to partner with landowners and land managers in order to facilitate the development of a credit generation project. Often they may seek to aggregate several land holdings into one larger project. They select a standard that they wish to execute against and conduct the necessary steps in order to compile an application. In some cases, the developer also serves as the credit broker. In other words, once the credits are generated, they will then seek to market on behalf of the landowner those credits to an interested buyer. In other cases, there may be an intermediate broker. A registry then also exists because somebody has to maintain the ledger. Often the standard setter maintains the registry, but there could potentially be a standalone registry that accepted credits from multiple standards. Their job is to make sure that they know who generated the credit, who purchased it, and if that purchaser applies it to emissions, then they retire the credit. And by doing this, the goal is to avoid any duplicity or double counting of generated credits offsetting emissions. Now, I've tried to put a pretty simplistic graphic together here about how the process might work. So a landowner and a developer first get together and initiate a project. They present that project to a registry according to their standard. That registry then provides information. Oops. Befuddled the Zoom. That registry would provide that information to a verifier, and then that verifier certifies to the registry that it was conducted in accordance with the standard. The developer then has an issued credit to market to a broker or through a broker to a buyer end user. Once that buyer decides to apply that credit to offset an emission, then they notify the registry and the registry retires the credit. So this is the flow, right, through the marketplace in our current voluntary market. Now, some key differences that landowners and managers should pay particular attention to as they consider potential entry into these marketplaces is that the standards and the protocols required by the standards may differ. There are emergent and existing sets of standards and protocols in place, and they may allow credit generation activities according to different required practices. And this is a key difference among various standards. In addition, a developer themselves may only decide to accept projects utilizing certain practices. Not that those practices are required by the standard, but just like a residential developer doesn't typically build shopping malls, they may find a standard or a practice that they're the most confident in. Methods of measurement can also differ among the protocols and standards that currently exist and which methods are acceptable under a given standard. Verification processes and the requirements for verification and the duration of performance. In other words, how long is somebody bound under a given standard? And finally, the two items I mentioned previously, the definitions for permanence. In other words, how does one assure that that carbon is permanently sequestered from the atmosphere? And what are the requirements for establishing permanence? And then additionality. Now, additionality is a pretty complicated topic. And the best way that I know to show it is with a simple graph like this. If we think about this as being the carbon mass in the soil, okay? And so if you look at the dark line, and let's just suppose I had 1 unit of carbon currently in my soil profile. And if that didn't change over time, it would just be that flat black line at the bottom. Now, it's likely because I do have grass growing on my property that some carbon might be accumulated whether I do anything or not. It's a passive activity. And that red line then might be my predicted accumulation of carbon under some business as usual circumstance. I could, however, change my management in some way, perhaps to accumulate more carbon than I would otherwise have done so. And that blue line at the top then represents my carbon accumulation that I would predict from that change in management. Now, what you notice on the right-hand side is there's 2 different ways for me to think about how much carbon I've accumulated. I could either measure the carbon accumulated above that baseline measurement, the amount that existed there at the beginning of the process, or I could measure the difference between what would have accumulated had I done nothing versus what did accumulate if I did something different. And so depending on how one defines additionality, you can see that there could be a substantial difference in the amount of carbon credited based on the difference in carbon from the beginning to the end. Now, if I think about producing carbon, and I am a producer at heart, and so I tend to think about this as a production process. I'm going to produce a ton of carbon and market it. And because of that, I want to consider what the production risks that occur are. The key risks really are that I don't know in most cases what the rate of accumulation of carbon is. In fact, I see a question coming in right now on that. And how do we determine what that rate could be? This is really one of the most difficult features of this entire process. There are a number of models that exist and some data that exists, but candidly, it's a very difficult thing to predict. The other is, how does my management influence that rate? Can I make decisions that promote more carbon accumulation? Are there practices that I should avoid that might actually reduce carbon storage? Is there a saturation or capacity limit in my soil? In other words, will it accumulate carbon up to a certain amount and then it's full? And the alternative to that is if a site is already relatively degraded, it may be in poor range condition or has had historical management practices that have disturbed the soil, it may have a much higher capacity to accumulate carbon. Currently, it's difficult to define, although we might theoretically expect that there is an upper limit to capacity in a given soil type. It's actually very difficult to predict what that capacity is or to determine if a limit will be reached in a meaningful time frame. Often we're talking about limits that might exist at century scales, not decade scales. One thing that really has been on our mind quite a bit over the last 2 years is how capable are we of measuring change in soil carbon at scale? I've put down there in the graphic at the bottom right, an image of one management unit on a ranch in South Texas with the ecological sites defined. And you can see there's quite a bit of variance across that landscape. Our ability to capitalize on produced credits is primarily dependent on our ability to make very sensitive measurements about small changes in carbon concentration over very large and diverse landscapes. Unfortunately, I can't tell you there is a clear solution to this problem today, but there are methods and certainly people working feverishly to try to solve that problem and gain better resolution. If we look at data that do exist across the Western United States, we can see that there is quite a bit of variability in the expected rates of carbon accumulation across all of these different sites. This variation occurs primarily because of weather. The current status of the soil, as I mentioned earlier, also has a large impact on the future accumulation potential. So prior state and weather, both of which are likely beyond managerial control, do have a large impact on this process. So we would say that this rate of accumulation is state. In other words, what is the current status of the land, and path? What path has it been on, and what is the path of management in the future, in addition to factors like rainfall that are beyond management control. An important thing I want you to observe from this graphic is that across all of these sites, while some on average over approximately a decade's worth of data at each site did have positive average accumulations, some had negative. At every site, at least 1 year had a large positive accumulation, and at least 1 year, with the exception of one site, had negative accumulation. In other words, carbon lost from the soil. This is strictly a function of weather. And so as we enter into this production, just like we enter into livestock production and we understand that we face weather risk, this particular production process is also subject to weather risk. I want to leave you with a last thought. If you look at this graphic from another pasture on a ranch in South Texas, you can see the blue bars representing the variable rainfall that occurs at that site over time. The dark red line represents accumulation of forage on an annual basis in that same pasture. What you notice is the upward trend over time. And I will say, as a fundamental sort of guiding principle, that anything that we do in our management strategy that promotes forage growth and increases vegetative cover on the landscape is likely to increase carbon accumulation in the soil. However, you can also see that strictly as a function of weather, that rate of accumulation, if it's consistent with the rate of forage production, could be quite variable in time. Last but not least, notice the upward trend over time in forage production at this site. What this indicates is that despite year-to-year variation, I'm optimistic that with good rangeland management and good production practices, we can have a positive impact on soil carbon accumulation and an opportunity, despite the risk, to capitalize on this credit market.
Hi, my name is Tiffany Lashman. I appreciate any opportunity to work with the folks at the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management. I'm excited to be here today to talk to you about the transactional risk related to these carbon contracts. When we say the term transactional risk, we primarily are talking about the contractual risk here, and that is some of what we're going to cover today. The most important thing I can tell people who are interested in entering into a carbon contract is probably also the simplest, and it is read the contract. And I don't mean like the rancher style read like my dad does on everything, right? Where you like read the first paragraph, decide that all lawyers are stupid, skim through and find the amount they're paying and sign it. That's not what I'm talking about. These contracts are extremely complex. They are extremely different from company to company. So it really is critical before you sign one of these contracts and enroll in one of these programs, you take the time to read it, really understand it. And I recommend having an attorney review it for you as well. It's just shocking some of the surprising terms you may find in those contracts. A couple of things I want to just note from the outset. One of them is, do keep in mind what we're talking about today is contracts, right? Private contracts between the landowner and either an aggregator or even maybe a company, and they're contracting to have this relationship where they sell carbon credits. What we're not talking about today, and doesn't really exist at this point, is some sort of government program that's paying you for carbon sequestration. And sometimes when we use the word program, I think people get confused on that. Could there be a government carbon type program in the future? Something through USDA, the Farm Service Agency, or the National Resource Conservation Service? Certainly. I actually think that's quite likely. But for now, that's not what we're talking about, right? These aren't government programs. These are those private contracts. And so they're governed by the terms of the contract. We're going to hit kind of the high notes of a few main considerations when you're looking at one of these contracts. But I do want to mention just a couple of other resources. Dr. Mathis mentioned at the outset that we'll be releasing the white paper that this group put together today. My section of that white paper goes into much more detail on the different considerations that you want to make before you enter into a contract. I've also got a podcast episode that I did that really goes through in great detail some of the considerations for landowners prior to entering into a carbon contract. I'm going to put the link to that in the chat box here in a moment for you all to have. So if you want more information, we certainly have it available. Just due to time constraints today, we're kind of hitting the high notes. One thing I want to talk about is the concept of stacking. This is something that is kind of unique to carbon contracts, and that I think could be very problematic if landowners don't understand these provisions. Almost all contracts, in fact, all of them that I have seen, have had a stacking provision. The basic concept of stacking is that these provisions basically say you can't enroll the same piece of property in more than one carbon contract, right? Which makes sense, right? So if I have my ranch and I sign a carbon contract to sell my credits to Google, I can't then use the same ranch and the same, soil to sell that same carbon credit to Amazon, right? That seems logical to me, makes perfect sense. The problem is that the devil's in the details on how broad some of these stacking provisions are. So if you've got a provision that's written the way I just described it, where we can't enter into multiple contracts, no problem, right? That's fine. Where it gets trickier is I've seen contracts where they're written significantly more broadly, and they might say something like, by signing this contract, you waive your right to participate in any other carbon-related programs or contracts. Now, this is where if the government comes out with a carbon program in the next few years, you may be contractually prohibited from entering into that program because of the way that stacking provision is worded. Even more concerning, I've seen another contract that goes broader, and it actually says a person who enters into this contract cannot enroll or accept any other sort of government program or assistance related to the property. Now we've gone broader than just you can't enter into another carbon program, but that could affect things like, your enrollment in EQIP or CRP, or the Title I programs like ARC and PLC. I sort of wonder about PRF insurance as well. So just watch the breadth of those stacking provisions and make sure you're not agreeing to some sort of exception that you may not really want to sign up for. Another key consideration when you're looking at these contracts, you have to make sure you understand the potential penalties that could arise under that contract. And this is where it can get a little bit complicated because the penalties and when they're triggered are different under every contract. But I'll tell you what I've seen people saying are things like this. If you sign up for, the contract with our company, you can just try it out. And if it doesn't work, you can just walk away. Let me just tell you a trick. Okay, this is like lawyer secrets talk here. You can never just walk away from a contract, right? That's why we have contracts. That's what lawyers do. So what you need to understand is for most of the contracts that I've seen where they have these type of provisions, yes, you may be able to terminate the contract early, but by doing so, you then are going to face the penalties that flow from that decision, right? So you can make the decision to get out, but that doesn't alleviate the consequences that may flow from that. So, for example, that could be anything from you forfeit any unvested portions of payments. It could be that you aren't going to get paid any additional payments that they have not made yet. It could be, I saw one that basically said the landowner needs to repay the company for every expense the company had related to that contract. Yeesh, right? Because now we could be talking about lawyer fees and measurement expenses and data analysts, who knows? Okay, so watch for that. Another place to watch for potential penalties, some contracts have what they call no reversal clauses. And essentially what these contracts say is they're going to go out in year one and take a measurement of the amount of carbon in the soil. And then they're going to come back at some other point. That can differ by contract. I think typically a lot of them are a 5-year remeasurement. If the amount of carbon has decreased in the soil, that may constitute a breach of contract. And again, a host of penalties may flow from that. The problem, of course, is there are a lot of things that can affect the amount of carbon in the soil that are outside of our control, right? Things like a drought, things like wildfire, right? There are just a lot of things that are uncertain that we can't control that we may be agreeing to assume this responsibility for. So just keep an eye on that as well. Amendments and assignments to the contract. This is something that typically speaking sort of seems like that lawyer fine print that people always skim over. But again, these can be hugely important, especially the way these are written in many of these contracts specifically. What you want to do is take a look and make sure you understand how and when the contracts can be amended. Right, so if the company wants to say, okay, we're going to amend the contract to change a term, what has to happen? Okay, some contracts, it's very simple that they have to notify you of the amendment and you have to sign off on it. Some contracts I've seen, they have to notify you of the amendment, and if you don't object within so many days, then it's deemed to be in effect. There's one contract I saw that had a provision that basically said they would email you and let you know if there was going to be an amendment to the contract. They got to decide those amendments at their sole discretion. And if you did not object, the amendment, went into effect. But if you did object, that could be viewed as a breach of the contract and they could terminate it. And you would be on the hook for breaching the contract, which is wild. That's not a common thing. So just be aware of that when you're looking at these contracts. Additionally, most contracts, truthfully, probably all of them that I've seen have allowed the company to make an assignment without the consent of the landowner. So one thing that we talk often about when we're looking at something like a carbon contract is do your due diligence, right? Do your homework and figure out who you're partnering with. Make sure the company who you're entering into a contract with is a good one. Make sure you're comfortable with entering into a relationship with that company. And that is important, okay? But understand that most of the contracts actually let that company who you did all that research on and who you have decided you're willing to partner with, assign that contract to some other company that maybe you never would have gotten into a deal with. So just keep that in mind. On the flip side of that, most contracts actually limit the right of a landowner to assign. So while the company can assign the rights, almost immediately, or without any sort of, agreement from the landowner, the same is generally not true for the landowner. And the landowner would likely have to get approval from the company to make some sort of assignment. Okay, this last slide I titled, "If Dr. Mathis Gave Me More Time, Here's What I Would Cover." And this was actually sort of effective because this slide got me 5 extra minutes. So here we go. When you're looking at these contracts, just a few more things to think about. Make sure that you understand exactly the practices you're agreeing to undertake pursuant to one of these contracts. For example, some contracts will say that the landowner agrees to engage in conservation practices. I'm going to need to know more detail about what that means right before I'm signing up and contracting to do it. So watch that. Really pay attention to the payment structure and the terms. So a misnomer, and Dr. Anderson will probably talk about this a little bit more, but most of the contracts, not all, but most of them offer a payment rate per ton of CO2 equivalent that is stored. So if you store a ton of carbon, they're going to pay you, let's just say $20 would be fairly kind of standard for the market that we see now. Hear me when I say that's $20 per ton of carbon. That doesn't mean $20 an acre. And I promise you what everybody hears and what everyone quotes to me is $20 an acre. And that would be right if you could store 1 ton of carbon per acre. The fact is that's going to be very high for most of us. Nationwide, they estimate that we have the potential to store about 0.6 of a ton of carbon in the soil per year. And again, that's nationwide and also on cropland, right? That's not just rangeland. In the panhandle here, our soil scientist tells me that it's more like 0.1 tons per year. And so all of a sudden that $20 payment rate goes to $2. So just watch that because that can be tricky. The length of the contract, again, just pay attention to how long you are signing up for. Data provision is another one that's important to keep in mind. Almost all of these contracts are going to require you to provide very significant data about your operation. Things like production records. I've seen them want weaning weights and calving percentages and conception rates, all these sorts of things about the operation. History of fire, history of pesticide or herbicide, also going to be required. Another thing that most of the contracts allow for is for the company or a contractor of theirs to come in and fly a drone over the property and inspect or take pictures. That may not be a big deal to you, but based on the number of phone calls I get questioning our legal right to shoot down those drones, I'm going to say it's a problem for some of y'all. So just be aware of that as well. Measurement and verification, we discussed that earlier. There's just a lot of uncertainty there. You want to make sure that if there's going to be any increase in property taxes because of your activities, they're going to cover that. Make sure that they carry insurance and agree to indemnify you if there's any sort of injury or damage. Watch for the choice of law and venue clauses. Those are going to tell you, you contractually agree where any sort of litigation can come up. And I'll just tell you that they're not going to be in King County, Texas, right? We're looking at, Boston or Miami or St. Louis, where a lot of these companies are based. So watch that. Class action waivers. Some of these contracts contain a provision that basically says by signing it, you agree that you will not take part in any future class action against these companies related to the contract. So again, you're just, waiving some legal rights there. You want to make sure you understand that before you do it. So with that, I'll turn it over. I'm happy to answer questions when we get to that point.
Well, great. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this project and to talk a little bit about market risk and the price of carbon credits. And, I think, really market risk and the price of credits and this really emerging market is really completely intertwined with Tiffany's talk, Jason's talk about, whether it's production risk or the contractual arrangements. These really can't be separated. They're all part and parcel of this together. And so I'm going to hit a few things in this really what I would call an emerging market for carbon credits. Maybe. If I can get my slide to advance. I'll go ahead and start talking and keep going, and then we'll see if we get this to roll forward. I may need some help with that. Clay, if you can run it, it's the next slide. Hey, there we go. We're working. Really, this idea of market price and risk. I would characterize this carbon market is really a young market. And it's an emerging market. And so with any of these, we have all these issues in markets, just like we have in lots of other markets, whether it's, price discovery, price determination, transparency. Much of the stuff that Jason described in terms of standards, developers, verifiers are really part of creating this market that we can have some confidence in. I think in hitting a point that Tiffany mentioned, on the assignment of these, you may enter an agreement with somebody and they may assign it to someone else. I think we ought to expect that there's going to be new entrants to this market and even some consolidation as we go forward, where some of these firms that are putting together buyers and sellers may consolidate and change, and we ought to expect to see that, and that's part of a new and emerging market. Now, Tiffany mentioned this idea of gross and net prices and this term that we see a lot, the dollar value of about $20 per ton. And that range, you'll see a range from $18 to $22. That's really become a price or a value that's been quoted a lot in the marketplace. I think it's very important to realize that, again, to reiterate what Tiffany said, in dollars per ton, if the change in carbon in your soil that you're looking at is 0.1 ton, then that change, that value per acre, is going to be about $2. So we're really talking about this in terms of the change you're going to provide, again, dovetailing with this production risk that Jason talked about, with this value in the marketplace of really $20 per ton. So again, that idea of change, the increase in production, and this is really the marketplace that we're seeing right now. So again, I think there's a couple of important parts here. The companies, a Google or whoever who are buying these may very well be paying much more for that dollars per ton, but those companies in the middle who are putting this together and making this market happen have costs as well. And so we're getting to this idea of this $20 per ton net to a farmer or rancher. On this production risk idea, lots of ag practices can store carbon, as we've talked about. And what I would get us to think about is that we are competing in this marketplace. As either we think of it as ranchers or as the rangeland, the rangeland's ability to increase carbon storage. We are competing in a marketplace with all the way from forestry and trees, row cropping systems, to a lot of other more high-tech systems for pulling carbon out of the air. And if we think about in this marketplace, every one of these practices has a cost with them to provide. This $20 per ton of carbon in the marketplace then really kind of dictates what kind of practices we're going to see first. And the ones that are the lowest cost to provide, or that can be profitably provided at $20 per ton, is what's going to happen first. So, I would work into this. I think it's very important as we figure out, am I changing my practices on the ranch, my grazing system, whatever it is I'm doing to increase soil carbon storage, to then generate this carbon payment. I would really strongly urge the thing to think about is those practices that you're putting in place have to be profitable to do. If we think of this $20 per ton and the net price being some fraction of that based on how much the increase in carbon you can get, some of those dollars, if, for example, if it's 0.1 ton, it's $2 per acre. That's not a lot of money in terms if we think about increasing or changing our system of production that may very well change our costs, but also may change our returns. So I want to think about this, not just signing a contract and getting a check, but how it fits into the total ranch operation so that the practice you're putting in place is profitable to do so first. I think that's really a kind of a critical thing to think about in this market. The other thing we think about market risk. If the price is $20 per ton per day, do we expect that to go up or down? I think we expect this to really grow over time, meaning that the demand for carbon sequestration, the demand for this from companies to become carbon neutral, to offset their other practices, is likely to grow. Growing demand for carbon credits, which means the price in the marketplace has to go up. And so as that price increases over the long term, over time, it's going to bid in practices that may be more costly, that may not be profitable to put in place at $20, but may be very profitable or more profitable at $30 or $40 per ton. So really what I think we expect to see over time is that this price or value is going to increase as the demand for this carbon sequestration grows. So if we can jump to that next slide, really to think for just a minute about risk. I think it immediately jumps to my mind, well, gosh, if I sell now, I might be getting a bad deal if that price is going to go up. And I think if I put this in some context, we think about this price increasing probably over a little longer term, not this year or next year or the year after, but over longer term, that we expect that demand to grow because it really is a new market. And so we have other, whether it's farming, row crop operations in other parts of the country, forestry are currently probably more in action right now. But as this demand grows, the price is expected to go up. But, that's really how we might think about it. I think a good question in the contract, or one for Tiffany, is, could I sell off a portion of the outfit now, but hold out other pieces of property or another portion of the ranch, thinking about some price appreciation later? Or can I try it out now, kind of on a trial, and see how it goes, and then worry about the rest later? I think that's an interesting question in this emerging market. Most of what we see is somebody putting in the whole farm or something like that. And, I think thinking about that as sort of a portfolio of activities that maybe we could do parts of it over time and see if we couldn't capture some price appreciation in the future. I think that's a good question in the contract. If we think there's upside, we ought to think about downside risk and can prices decline or this market disappear? And certainly they could. I tend to think there's more upside to this than downside. I mean, if you don't sign a contract and this market disappears, what are you really out? If you do sign on and then later it disappears, well, you got something and you did something different in your practices and hopefully made some profitable decision. So, really, I tend to think of this as really the change in practices to store more carbon. If we think about that as, let's make sure the best we can that is a profitable decision, then look at adding on the value of this carbon appreciation, and think about it in a portfolio of what we're doing, so that particularly to store more carbon, we don't do something else that reduces our profitability or reduces our revenue from other parts of the total outfit. I think is really an important key to this in overall. And so really, I think, that's my last slide. I really wanted to hit about 3 or 4 of these things. One, make sure it's profitable, and then go forward with exploring some of these ideas. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, David. Given that we are sending out a white paper at 1 o'clock, a lot of this will be covered, but I'll be very brief so that we have a chance for questions in my summary. First, I think Jason did an excellent job of describing the biological processes involved, as well as describing that the end results are a result of things. Some things ranchers can change and some things they can't. For instance, a rancher may be able to change his grazing system and stocking rates, but he can't change the weather. The other thing is a lot of the results may depend on the current soil stage or condition of the property. To me, it's a little bit of an irony that probably the better range condition you're currently in may limit the delta or change or increase in carbon storage you may realize. Jason also talked about all the market participants all in the system, the roles they play, and how they could help you. I will say that there are 5 or 6 major developers and verifiers out there now, and I think as time goes on and we have more experience, that will weed itself out. But they are readily available by a Google search. Tiffany, the most important thing she said is read the contract, and I'd add to that, understand the contract, because there is quite a bit of complexity in these contracts. What are the prohibitions? Many of us on this webinar take EQIP funds, and so what is by signing one of these would prohibit that in the future? What are the penalties if we're not able to comply, or if the results are not what we expected or predicted in the future? All of us in the cattle business know that strategic planning and prediction is just proof that God has a sense of humor. Also, the fact that there's unilateral approach to both amendments and assignments. How does this affect my ability to operate? And question I had, maybe even sell the property. David, I think, did a great job in indicating that this was a young and emerging market, and it's certainly going to change as we see the feasibility and results. What is the actual cost of providing service versus the gross price? Some of the prices I've heard are that for measurement and sampling, administration, brokerage fees can amount to 20% of the total gross. We don't really know. And what are your costs of implementing these practices? You may have fencing and labor costs. You may have reduced stocking rates. You may change your grazing system. There's certainly a cost associated with that as well. And we need to be sure that that total investment is worthy of us signing this contract. Demand will likely increase, and as these prices increase, some of the things that might not be feasible today likely will. But one thing will stand true, and that is that using normal business analytics such as net present value, return on investment, payback period, as long as we put good data in, these are good tools to use in the analytical process. In closing, I'll simply say that there's a lot of research going on. going on trying to define better measurement and cheaper measurement processes, which reduce for standard deviations and other things. So I think it's a market that's emerging that creates potential, but there's certainly some unknowns that we need to account for before we make a final decision.
All right, thank you very much, Dave, for wrapping us up. And special thanks to each one of our speakers. I'll ask that the speakers go ahead and turn all of your cameras back on. And we have 34 questions to work through. So I think we're going to have some good, robust discussion. This effort to vote these questions up has put them in a priority order, and we'll work through that list according to that priority order. I may address questions specifically to particular speakers, or I may put them out to the field and have the field of speakers decide who feels comfortable fielding the question. By this time, each of you should have received an email that gives you access to the white paper that this webinar accompanies. So I hope that as you get that white paper, it will answer many of the questions that you might have, but we're going to try to answer them one at a time here. If a question that you have submitted gets answered by a prior question or in the answering of a prior question, go ahead and see if you can't just dismiss or remove that question so we don't address it a second time. So with that, let's just start with the first question. And the question is, are agencies available to connect producers with buyers? How does a producer locate a buyer? Dr. Sawyer, you covered this in your presentation as much as anybody did. Could you go ahead and field that?
Well, I'll do my best, Clay. It's a great question. And this really is, as Dr. Anderson talked about, fundamental to making a market, right? Is how do you get a buyer and a seller connected? Because there's really not a clearing exchange that exists today for these kind of variable products, if you want to think of it that way. The best way currently for a buyer and a seller to get connected is really through a project developer. There are a few independent brokers who are seeking to purchase accumulated credits because they may already have buyers in line. But often or I guess I would say currently, there's not a single clearing agency. There's not a centralized exchange that says, hey, all buyers and sellers bring your stuff here and trade. And so it really is kind of a one-off deal. But certainly with the increase in demand that Dr. Anderson talked about, and sort of the visibility of developers in the space, as they gain visibility, then buyers come to them, and those transactions can be consummated. Often the standard setters themselves have buyers directly inquire, and so can facilitate sometimes that communication between buyers and sellers. But there's not a single entity today that serves in that role that I'm aware of.
Dr. Anderson, do you have anything to add to that, or is that good enough?
I think that's a good answer.
Okay. All right, let me see what the next question on the list is. This is going to really go back to Dr. Sawyer again. How do I determine our delta potential? And can you also explain what's meant by delta potential when you answer that?
Sure. The delta, we talk a lot about the delta, right? The change in measured carbon being the foundational sort of measure of production of carbon credits. So that delta that they're asking about there is the change in soil carbon translated into carbon dioxide equivalents. How many credits did I generate? That's the delta. I'll be honest with you, the $1 million question is, can I precisely predict my capacity to produce, right? That's what the delta is. It's my capacity to produce carbon credits. Can I look at features of my ranch and make a determination about what that capacity is? And, just being candid, right? That's a really difficult proposition. There are any number of people making that attempt. We are among those people, right? We have a deep interest in being able to precisely estimate that. The best I can do right now is tell you some generalities. And you can maybe seek some additional input from other experts that are actively working in the area. As Dave Delaney mentioned earlier in his talk, soil type matters. Importantly, soil type and average annual rainfall matter together. So in lower precipitation areas, clay soils do tend to accumulate carbon at greater rates. In higher precipitation areas, sandy soils actually accumulate at greater rates. So there are many it depends in the answer. The biggest things are to evaluate your site. What is your soil type, soil depth, current vegetation cover, and rainfall? And those are the factors that are most likely to give you the best estimates of your potential to produce.
You know, there's a related question down towards the bottom about types of branch units where you might have in this case, fertilized hay fields, brush, improved pastures, different types of land that might have different rates of accumulation that where you might want to do it on one part of it, but not on the others. And so, you know, I think that's a related question to that where, you know, there might be some opportunities there to kind of pick the best spot.
Sure.
The other thing I might pitch there is I know that at Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, the folks in the soil and crops department are working on this. There's in particular a soil scientist in Lubbock who has done quite a bit of research, at least for the Panhandle area. So that might be a resource. If you just need to figure out where to even start, you might contact your extension agent and see if they can help get you in touch with folks here.
And I might, in the same vein, Tiffany, point people, NRCS has put out the Comet Planner tool in order to give people at least a starting place. And that tool is really more practice-based, like if you adopted a certain practice, but it does try to take into consideration your county and make a rough estimate of what expected soil conditions might be. So again, it's a great question. There's not a particularly precise answer. Here's a couple of resources. You know, go to NRCS, go to AgriLife Extension, and maybe you at least can get a starting place. There are a number of companies that have developed models to try to make those predictions. Unfortunately, as Dave Delaney said earlier, if I make a prediction about what's going to happen over the next 10 years, I got to wait 10 years to find out if I'm right.
Great, thank you, Pete. I hope that answered your question well enough. We'll move on to the next one, which is what are the measurement practices expected? And the other part is, are the measurements the financial responsibility of the rancher? Who would like to field that?
Well, I'll take a lawyer stab at it. The lawyer stab at it is it all depends on what you agree to in the contract. And so those contracts will offer you at least some level of explanation of what type of measurement is going to be done. Some of them use that Comet tool that Dr. Sawyer mentioned. Some will talk about actually coming out and taking, you know, physical soil probe measurements. And then as far as the expense, that is absolutely something that should be negotiated in the contract. And I've seen several contracts that do make that cost the obligation of the purchaser of the credit. I certainly would encourage folks to ask for that. I'll let Dr. Sawyer, you may know more about the specific difference in the measurements.
Well, actually, I think that's a great answer, Tiffany, because the measurement practices that are expected or required are really conditioned on which standard the project is being developed under. And so we mentioned that there are several different standards that may be more or less available to producers in different areas. And really, it's those standards and the protocols under those standards that define what measurements are required to be adherent to the standard, right? That's part of what the standard does, is to describes how you have to take the measurements necessary to certify a credit. And so really the standard typically defines that measurement requirement. As a developer makes the contract, as Tiffany said, with a landowner, they're going to borrow the language from the standard that they've selected and incorporate that into that contract with the landowner. And so the determination of precisely what is required varies by standard. I'm gonna just go out on a limb and say that the standards that are receiving the most attention right now are based on direct measurement. And I'm bringing this up because of another question that's in the queue there. And the reason that the most kind of accepted standards right now are direct measurement based is because there's a lot of uncertainty about modeled or remote sensed data. In other words, it's not proven completely that it's as reliable as going out and taking a soil sample. And so most of the required measurements are going to be direct measurements under the sort of the most active standard today. The desire certainly is to create technological tools that would allow reduction of direct sampling and an increase in, say, remotely sensed or modeled outcomes. But as Dave Delaney told us at the very beginning, at this emergent stage, probably the most important thing is that the markets be perceived as having integrity, right? Being very, very concrete. And so until people are convinced that these other technical tools than direct measurement are acceptable, that's likely to be the dominant measurement requirement in the near future.
I might, Dr. Mathis, if I can piggyback on that, just this will save us another question later. Someone asked, are the contracts making a payment based on the measured additional carbon or on implementing a practice? And again, the answer is it depends on the contract. Like Dr. Sawyer said, most of them are actually looking at a measurement or a modeled increase, right? And they're paying based on that increase. There are a couple, I know of one for sure, that actually is a payment for practice. I mean, it would be similar to like CRP, right? Where you adopt the required practice and they pay you so much per acre just for adoption. They don't have any sort of measurement or modeling to see if it actually increased anything. So that was just a question in the chat we could knock out.
Could I add one thing to that too? You know, the fact I earlier said that according to Kyoto protocols, that practices which pay for themselves or are self-funding are not eligible for trading in the European market. Maybe the fact that we currently in an emerging market don't have exchanges, the one we did have shut down over 12 years ago, is a good thing because we can look what's practical and we can implement different things. For instance, one oil and gas company is focusing on highly arid areas, which probably are in that 0.1 ton per acre potential, but they see it as the greatest societal benefit because they'll be able to improve the ecological diversity of that region. So they're actually, not to confuse the additionality term, Jason, but looking at other things other than just soil carbon storage. And one other thought, this measurement, remote measurement could be the most practical and probably long-term the cheapest, but there's a lot of research going on because measurements can have high standard deviations. They can be expensive to implement. And I think as that part of the cost diminishes, that might bring in the ability to more of these marginal lands be eligible or be feasible. So,
well, thank you. We got a couple of questions answered then. It looks like our rate of question gathering is exceeding our rate of question answering. So we'll move on to the next one. This question's from Steve Swinson. Dave Delaney, why don't you answer this? Basically, what are the economic benefits of selling carbon credits?
well, let me put on my rancher shoes. And right now, I could not go in front of a board and with any accuracy tell them this is something we should do. We should sign the contract at this point and do that. I think it all depends in the potential. And I think, you know, any decision is based on what is my production and what is my certainty of that production. I think there probably going to be some low-hanging fruit in rangelands that you know, are going to be feasible that they're going to be able to do. I think especially as you get in more arid areas, there's probably going to be more that are more dependent on rainfall and the various variables that affect it. I think it's going to change. So, I mean, the advantage, as I said, I think it needs to be addressed from a purely analytical standpoint. What is the rate of return? What is the net present value? What is the payback period? And how confident am I in that I can accomplish those production practices, which are part of the contract to get me there, and are the results could be what I expect. So I don't know if that answered Steve's question, but you know, if you asked me if I'd implement one today, I'd probably, you know, I'd look at it, might, as Dave said, do part of the higher producing potential areas, but I'm unsure about what the markets, how they may develop. As we put in mandated cap and trade, if that happens in the United States, like in California, those auction costs are $8 to $10 higher than the voluntary markets. And I think if we, all of a sudden became a mandate, price could go up. So you don't want to tie yourself into something that doesn't allow you to take advantage. And I think this, you know, they're saying it's going to be a $230 billion market by 2030. I don't know if that's true or not, but you know, when you look at the total value of the beef production chain, that's a big number. So,
Great, thank you, Dave. Next question from Verl. Since photosynthesis, rainfall drives the plant's ability to store carbon, and let's say we hit a 1 year, 2 year, or 3 year drought, and a landowner has no net positive carbon storage, but a carbon loss, will that landowner be billed for those carbon decreases? Tiffany, can you answer that question?
You're going to see a theme in my answers, Dr. Mathis. Yes, it depends on the contract, but potentially. There are certain contracts that do impose a penalty if there's a situation where there is a reduction in the amount of carbon stored. And that's the perfect example, right, of something we can't control where there could be a reduction. And so that's something you certainly want to look for in the contract to see if there is that type of, they would call it a no reversal clause. If that type of penalty exists, that's exactly what would happen.
Great, thank you. Hopefully that answered your question, Verl. The next question from Mark. What are some examples of practices that increase carbon sequestration in the soil? Dr. Sawyer, can you tackle that one?
Well, I'll do my best. And unfortunately, there's so many, it depends. I think Dave mentioned in his introduction, you know, as many as 30 different factors have been identified that affect soil carbon accumulation rate, and they all interact with one another. So what I'm going to do is suggest practices that at large and on average are expected to have positive impacts. The first one, and probably of most interest to this audience, is that managed grazing versus not grazing on average increases soil carbon accumulation. Now, that's a pretty positive thing. If we get into sort of fine details about specific grazing practices, the outcomes to that are quite variable. I would say that the management practice that's most accessible to most ranches is managing your grazing according to generally accepted best management practices for rangeland management. The fine details of that get into lots of it depends. What does that mean? Well, that means that if we can increase the amount of vegetative cover and reduce bare ground through our grazing management plan, we're at least favoring our chances for better accumulation rate. Other practices that have been evaluated and tend to have positive effects would be, say, fertilization. Dr. Anderson mentioned that. That might only be relevant in sort of improved pasture situations and higher precipitation zones, but adding nitrogen to the plant increases plant growth, and increased plant growth increases soil carbon or below ground carbon accumulation. Other practices really, you know, prescribed fire is something that we have a lot of interest in. There's good evidence that fire at appropriate intervals, because of its stimulation for vegetative growth and biomass production, is likely to increase soil carbon, which is often we think of fire as being destructive, right, to carbon. And certainly it removes some above ground carbon, but the jury is still out. There's a few reports, but they kind of vary. The last practice that I would mention, because it does get kind of asked about quite a bit, is brush control. And there's, again, no real data that I'm aware of that has specifically evaluated that over time. We know that in South Texas, for example, large brush moths tend to be nutrient accumulators underneath them, but they also have a lot of bare ground. And so if we remove that canopy and allow grass and forb vegetative cover to replace it, what is the effect on soil carbon change? And candidly, I wish I knew that answer. Ask me again in about 2 years and maybe we'll have a better idea.
Great. Thank you. Next question from Taylor, and this is a really important question because we hear about it from a lot of the folks that are already great managers. And the question is what can we do if our land management practices are already good and that there is no real uplift of carbon to get? Does that mean we can't really participate? Who would like to field that?
I'm going to start because nobody else wants to. Oh, Tiffany did. Never mind. Go.
No, yours is better. I'm sure you're better. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, so I'm gonna address this by going back to the definition of additionality. And under the Kyoto definition, the answer to this question is absolutely you cannot participate. That's it. Now, because the US doesn't necessarily operate fully under the Kyoto definition of additionality that Dave talked about, what I would say here is that it's more difficult to participate because it might be difficult to achieve a positive delta, right? If you're already at saturation, for example. But because we don't know, we don't know. Here's what I do think on this particular question. I think that it makes an accumulation model a little bit more difficult to access, but there might be opportunities. There are some that already exist and some that are likely to emerge for what's called avoided emissions or avoided conversion. So if I have historically accumulated a lot of soil carbon, is there a way for me to have incentive not to release it? And there are examples of those kinds of contracts, and there is at least one standard that historically had been proposed. It's not very active. There's only really one project in North America I'm aware of under that standard. That doesn't mean that's the only one, it's just the one I'm aware of. And so that might be the alternative view for somebody who has managed in a way that has resulted in high soil carbon storage to capitalize on that historical management. Under current paradigms, it's difficult to capitalize on historic management, only really to capitalize on future outcomes.
So I'm going to add something to that. And so I think that's a question that's asked a lot. And it's been asked a lot on the row crop side of things too. And what I'm going to probably suggest is the reason you've been a good manager is because it's more profitable to be a good manager. And you've implemented practices that get you a better outcome. And so, tearing that out to go get a few bucks on this is probably the wrong thing to do, just from a profitability standpoint. But I think it's a good question, where do the rewards of some of this go to, and sort of a fairness type idea and things like that. But I think it's a pretty common question. But if you've done this stuff because it's the right thing to do and it's more profitable to do so, then you're probably okay.
And I'll just echo on that. I've really seen this in the contracts on the row crop side, but some contracts actually talk about that and say, if you had already implemented the practice, like let's just say cover crops. If you had already implemented cover crops, you can't sign up for the contract. But some have a look back period that say something like, if you've implemented cover crops in the last 5 years or the last 10 years, then you can qualify. So some contracts really spell that out. I have not seen that spelled out on rangeland contracts in particular.
All right. Well, I hope that answers that question well enough. The next question, and this was the first one we got in. Let me, I'll read a portion of it. With regard to the new bill signed this week, Title II, Section 21001, Agriculture Conservation Investments, how does the funding schedule for the Commodity Credit Corporation impact carbon credits for ag and ranching? It appears to be significant funding, but unsure. Tiffany, can you field that one?
Well, I can try. Yeah, so what he's talking about is there was a new bill that was signed this week by the legislature, by Congress, that's authorizing significant funds to the Commodity Credit Corporation to enhance certain conservation programs. And so could those funds be used for a carbon type program? Absolutely. Will they be? We have no idea, right? We don't know how the CCC will decide to allocate those, but that's something I think to be on the lookout for, because like I said earlier, I do think we're going to see some of those governmental type programs coming up in the future. Now, how will that specific provision affect these carbon contracts that we're looking at now? I don't think that it will, because again, these are private contracts between private parties. And so I doubt that that funding for programs is going to have an impact on these contracts we're discussing today.
All right, thank you. Next question. Do you see the USDA getting into carbon credit in the next farm bill?
I'm not the farm bill expert, to be clear. Dr. Anderson is certainly more well-versed than me. He teaches the policy class. But yeah, if I was going to guess, yeah, that wouldn't surprise me at all.
I suspect that's going to be talked about a lot. I think one of the things in any of the farm bill discussions depends on the budget and what kind of money they have available. And that's likely to be really pretty tight and really the determining factor of what they can do anyway on any type of farm program thing. So yeah, I think those type of topics that are going to be talked about a lot and already are.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Okay. Next question from Wade. How long is the typical contract?
With the caveat that really none of these are typical, just because I promise I'm not exaggerating when I tell you everyone is really extremely different. I would say like the more standard numbers you see is somewhere in that 10-year range.
Okay. Hope that answers that question well enough. Next
Clay,
question. Oh, you want to
Clay,
speak?
I'm sorry. Let me just tag on to Tiffany's comment there. I mean, certainly agree with that. And back to it depends, because of the difference among standards. You might see any number from absolute 10 years, rolling 10 years. 25 years is not uncommon. There is a 100-year standard. And so it's all over the map. But so that, again, as Tiffany had pointed out in her talk, you need to pay attention to that before you sign a contract, because it could be anything up to and including perpetuity.
Okay. Next question from Taylor. Is the stacking prohibition from use of a government cost share program and an EQIP, CRP, CSP, is it fairly common or rare in contracts? Tiffany?
Yeah, I would say rare. I can think of one, there may be two that are that broadly written. So I think that it's rare. I think more common would be the prohibition on entering into any other government carbon program, but still allowing those other programs that we're already accustomed to. So rare, but does exist.
Okay. Next question. Can producers create credits, have them independently verified by a third party, and take them to market independently as established credits outside of a contract? Who would like to field that?
I'll make a stab at it. It's an unregulated market. And if you have economies of scale and you can find a buyer that feels that he can, that there's somebody to verify, that he feels comfortable that his shareholders would be, there's nothing technically to prevent that arrangement at the current time, I believe. Is that from a legal standpoint? I mean, my understanding of the system.
Yeah, I guess that my answer to that, I would say the best way to think about that question is, can a ranch be their own developer? And there's absolutely nothing to prevent that at all, other than in order to get the credits certified, because I don't believe that there's really a lot of appetite in the marketplace for somebody to buy a bespoke credit that hasn't been certified under a standard. And so in order to get that credit certified under a standard, you have to know enough about the standard to follow the rules and follow their required procedures for verification. But beyond that, I would say certainly a ranch could do it themselves, so long as they have the confidence they could adhere to the standard.
All right, thank you. Next question from Alejandro. Is it possible to measure carbon sequestration using a remote sensing technology such as satellites and artificial intelligence? I think, Dr. Sawyer, I think you're the one that could handle the measurement. Could you field that one?
Well, I was trying to kind of get at this question, and as we were discussing that previously, so I'll just kind of restate. Is it possible to measure it using remote sensing technology coupled to some sort of a model like an AI model? There is an enormous amount of effort being expended on that very activity as we speak. That's maybe one of the biggest research topics, both at universities and in private companies, that's ongoing in this space right now. So is it possible? Yes. Or can we do it confidently and accurately enough today to satisfy the requirements of a buyer? Probably not. And so I think that over the next 5 years, that the success rate of developing those technologies is really the key to unlocking the full potential of this marketplace. But I don't think we're there today. Let's see what happens.
All right. Next question. Please talk about feasible practices that will increase carbon storage on rangeland. I think we've addressed that some, but maybe we can just hit the real short version of that again, the highlight.
Yeah, I mean, I'm basing this on kind of the assembly of data that exists that have shown positive outcomes to various management practices. And I think the one that's the most accessible to most ranches is grazing management. And I don't necessarily mean adoption of a particular grazing strategy. I mean managing according to generally accepted good grazing management practices. And then on an individual basis, perhaps you can, find a solution that works better for you. So grazing management is an actionable practice. Brush control, I said, was one that could be positive, but we just really can't make a good determination about right now. Prescribed fire at appropriate return intervals is likely to be beneficial, but with some caveats. Fertilization on improved pastures has been shown to increase carbon accumulation, but that's likely not to be a feasible practice on rangelands. And so really those are the ones that I think are sort of the most directly accessible. I might refer the group to, well, maybe on the website or something later, Clay, we can post a review article that looked at like 20 or 30 different practices, everything from earthworm incorporation to grazing management, and gave sort of a range of estimated benefits. And maybe we can just post that reference for people to review.
Okay, Dr. Sawyer, we'll give you a break for a question. We'll go to Dr. Anderson. Can you confirm that dollars per ton is paid on a yearly basis?
In the contracts I've seen, they measured every year, and it was on that change in carbon, and it was a yearly payment. Those are at least from what I've seen. I'm not aware of any that paid, say, at the end of 10 years or something like that, but there could be some of those. I don't know, Tiffany, have you seen any that had a different kind of schedule?
The one thing that I think I do want to flag, and we didn't talk about this earlier, is some contracts have a vesting provision. And so if you earn a certain amount of payment in year one, that payment's not fully vested to you until year 5. And so that's where, like, if you decided to walk away from the contract in year 3, there could be some real implications on the unvested portion you would not take with you. But yeah, the answer is it's a, payment typically per year on that carbon storage.
Great. Okay, next question from Dr. Pascal. Is there a standardized analysis of carbon level in the soil, or are there several analytical methods? Is one better than another? Do they vary by soil, ecological region, or biomass cover? How is the sampling done over a large ranch or even pastures? Dr. Sawyer, could you answer those 4 questions?
Sure. So the key word there being standardized. And so typically in a standard, they will define or describe what the acceptable laboratory method for the assessment of soil carbon is. And that can be quite detailed. The gold standard method is dry combustion, not sort of loss on ignition, right? And those are pretty technical terms. But if you talk to a soil lab, you could ask them, do you do dry combustion? And they can tell you yes or no. That is really the gold standard method and is defined in several of the standards as being the required analytical method. Is one better than another? Dry combustion is believed to be the most precise measure and the least influenced by other factors in inorganic carbon, for example, in the soil. Do they vary by soil, ecological region, et cetera? No, that's the standard method for laboratory analysis. The only real difference is the treatment of inorganic carbon, for example, in caliche type soils or soils with significant caliche layers in them. So caliche is calcium carbonate. It has a lot of carbon in it, but it's not organic carbon. And so different standards may describe or define how they manage for those, I'm going to call them contaminants. They're not really, right? But for other sources of carbon in the soil. And that's really, again, defined by the standard or by the laboratory doing the measurements. The last one is the hard one. How is sampling done over a large area? And I kind of mentioned that in my portion of the talk, right? That how do you apply this at scale? And so this is a really difficult question. Currently, the sort of best practice approach to that is to take into consideration various features of that landscape and lay out a sampling design that best represents all of that variability that would allow you to get a robust sample of that landscape. And how do you do that? Well, you do that using a variety of satellite tools and sort of mapping tools that are available. There's a number of different approaches to create that sort of sampling plan. And that's the way it's done in an attempt to best represent the landscape that's being evaluated. The problem is, how many samples does it take to get that representation? And, that's something that at the Institute, we've worked on over the last couple of years, trying to wrap our minds around that and get at a reliable number. But certainly that's a continuing challenge, is how do we do that at scale and at reasonable cost? Because certainly that's where a lot of the cost, as Dr. Anderson talked about, cost of delivering this product is primarily tied up in the sampling regime. So hopefully I addressed some of those questions.
Great.
I might add something too that's in part of this. I think Jason addressed in his presentation kind of this carbon changes by weather and everything else. So over time, if you're going to test, let's say they came and did that initial baseline test at, I'm just going to say an arbitrary date, March. because we know those carbon levels fluctuate seasonally through the year. You might not want to sample. Well, you might want to be careful when you do the samples to see if you've achieved anything, because you wouldn't want to sample at the time of year that it's always lower. You know, might want them to sample it when it's always higher, just in case. But you know, I think that's a consideration in the testing and seeing, you know, evaluation over time, is that you're doing things to kind of eliminate some of that variability that might actually work against you.
An example of that would have been, notwithstanding the prohibition clause Tiffany addressed, you'd have probably done real well the first year you put property in a CRP program to test the soil carbon, and then 5 years later, that would have probably made it.
That would have helped.
Jason, just a comment. I want you to respond to it, but is it fair to say that one of the greatest challenges to being able to confidently sell carbon credits is your ability to determine accurately what your soil carbon is today, and then in a period of time later to again accurately determine what your soil carbon is then?
Absolutely, Clay. I mean, and it's not, you know, we had the question from Dr. Pascal about, you know, the laboratory method. It's not because we don't know how to send the soil sample in and for them to evaluate that sample. It's the fact that if I collect 100 samples across a landscape, they're not all the same, right? There's variability there. And this delta we keep talking about is a statistical test of difference. And so the more variable my samples are, the more samples I have to be able to detect a difference. So it's about our ability to detect. We talk about 1 ton of CO2, right, as a carbon credit. If I think about that on a per acre basis, when we go measure soil carbon, right, we measure carbon, the percentage of carbon in the soil. And if I have average bulk density in my soil, then 1 ton of carbon is a 0.014% change. So that means if I went out today and my soil carbon measurement was 0.5% carbon in my soil, a 1 ton change goes from 0.5 to 0.514%. That's a really, really small number. And so our capacity to account for that variation and tell that we actually affected something is, in my opinion, the biggest limitation.
Thank you. Okay, next one on the top of our list here is from Matt. Where can I find an example of a standard contract template to review? Tiffany, do you know where something like that might exist?
With the caveat again that there's no standard contract. Y'all are gonna be so sick of hearing me say those words. With that caveat, yes. Frankly, you can Google it. Some companies have them posted online. I've got a kind of a collection here. I'd sure be glad to send anybody who wants them. If you want to contact me, I'll send those. But like I say, you could pretty simply Google, you know, carbon contracts, and a lot of them are posted online.
Great, thank you. Next question from Jim. Are the most recent, this is David Anderson for you, are the most recent contracts trading in the $18 to $20 per ton range? The CME is trading prices from $750 to $850 per ton for December settlement. Any response to that, David?
You know, yeah, that's what we're seeing in the marketplace. What is that difference? You know, is that a basis that we could think about and actually do something with? I don't know. What's the difference in standards and certification and verification between the CME and what we see in these contracts? I'm not sure what that difference is either. In that case, it kind of depends on which system or protocol you're in or contract you're under. So I'm not quite sure how to compare those two, quite honestly. If what I see on the CME is really the right one, how are we getting $20 offers? And that, then in that case, that might look like a really good idea to grab it while you can. But I'm not sure how to or what the correct context or how those things fit together. That sounds like a pretty sorry answer. I saw that question. I've been pondering on it for a while and was hoping you weren't going to choose that one.
I mean, on the one hand, it looks like a pretty good long spec position to take, but I think just as kind of some food for thought there, and I would encourage anybody to go on the CME website and look at their environmental offset contract specification. It's a little bit opaque, but probably the big differentiator there is that there's really only one sort of standard that they consider acceptable to meet the requirements of that contract spec. And it's actually a bit vague because they talk about environmental offsets at large. And so I think that the basis that you observe there is because you're not really comparing apples to apples. If you look at sort of $20 a ton for a carbon dioxide equivalent versus the units of environmental offsets that contract is based upon. You also might look at what the open interest on those contracts in. I think the trading volume is like 600 contracts or something. So I think there's just a bit of an apples and oranges problem at present, with that comparison.
Just to add to that, I think what I've read about the EU ETS emissions trading system, there's been a lot of complaints about it's pretty specific and the requirements are pretty defined, and there's several exchanges trading it, but it hasn't there's been quite a bit of criticism about it. And so as you open this environmental deal with the ambiguities and such, I think before it becomes large scale, I think there's a lot of questions that need to be answered, and standards and some other things. I'm just saying that, and I think the open interest, as Jason said, may be indicative of the willingness of some of these large corporations, which have massive greenhouse gas emissions, to utilize that.
And we may see some change over time in the cost of providing this service as you're a verifier or a kind of developer and all of that. There's a cost to doing that service, and those costs are that margin in that area may very well change over time too.
Okay, we're coming up close to a hard stop. I'm going to put one more question forward because I've seen it addressed in part in several of the ones. And Tiffany, this is going to come to you. It's a question for Mark Erickson. It says, how much ability to negotiate these contracts terms does the landowner have?
Yeah, I saw that and actually thought it might have been the best question that was asked all day from my portion of the program anyway. The answer, it depends on the company that you're dealing with. There are some companies who I've been told are very willing to negotiate. There are others who have flat told landowners, this is our form, you can take it or leave it. And so some advice I got from a lawyer who does a lot of these is one of the first questions he has potential clients ask is just that. Are you willing to negotiate? Can we make changes to this contract? If the answer is yes, then they move forward. If the answer is no, and there are what they consider to be kind of deal breakers in that original form they were provided, then they don't waste their time kind of messing with it. So I think that's a great question to ask at the outset to figure out, how much negotiation room there is. And it just depends on the company.
Great. Well, thank you. I'll tell you what, we're really at the point where we need to wrap up and be done here. Just from the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management perspective, I just want to say thank you to this rapid action team that we put together. Dr. Sawyer, thank you for your leadership of this group. I think this has turned into what we had envisioned, a guide for producers to help this industry that we serve, that we love, to make a decision on what could be a long-term decision for them. And so this is the type of service that we want to continue to have for this industry. Everybody should have received, that's on this, should have received that white paper, and either as a link or a way you can access it as a PDF even. Please share this with anybody. Again, this is our service to the industry. This webinar and the Q&A portion of it will be available by recording either at the end of this week, but certainly by the middle of next week. We hope that you'll be able to share this and get this in front of as many of the producers in this industry that we can, because we want to help people make more informed decisions. So with that, we greatly appreciate everybody that stayed on here, even 150 of you to the very, very end. Hopefully that we can continue to serve you in some way in the future. And we're very grateful to each one of you. So thank you very much.